We are just 2 weeks away from the 5th anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. A half a decade later, some in MAGA world are trying to rewrite the history of that tragedy, calling on President Trump to pardon Derek Chauvin, the police officer convicted in Floyd's murder.
The left wing is big mad at the idea, at the notion that President Trump, the evil orange man himself, is reportedly considering issuing a pardon to former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin for his federal convictions related to the George Floyd incident. Now, I happen to think this is incredibly unlikely. This is just a rumor that seems to be kicking around because we're approaching the 5-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. But in this video, I'm going to talk about the updates related to this, who's actually driving the campaign to get Derek Chauvin pardoned, and whether or not there is any merit to the allegations, or allegations as the super mayor would say,
false allegations and not facts,
that the trial against Derek Chauvin was rigged. But before we get into that, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay.
Let me go right to it. A federal pardon wouldn't have any impact on Chauvin's 23-year sentence on state murder charges that you won. So why do you think voices on the right, like Ben Shapiro, are pushing for a federal pardon?
I think they're pushing for it because they want to agitate and outrage people. But as you just pointed out, Rev, for those who may not know, I don't know if Trump's going to pardon Chauvin or not, but if he does, it doesn't change his prison sentence. He still owes Minnesota 22 and a half years, and he's going to do it either in Minnesota or somewhere, but he's not getting out.
So as you can see, Al Sharpton and Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison are really angry at the prospect that Derek Chauvin could get a federal pardon for his federal charges, and they are vowing that this will not mean that he is going to get released onto the streets, because the fact is they have state-level convictions for homicide charges that they actually ended up securing against Derek Chauvin that essentially align up perfectly with his federal sentence. And for those of you who aren't aware, Derek Chauvin essentially got 22 years at the state level in the state of Minnesota, and he pled guilty to federal civil rights violations, and he is serving 21 years on those counts. However, these are concurrent sentences, meaning he's getting credit for both of them at the same time. It's not like he does the 21 years federal and then he has to follow it up with 22 years in the state prison. It is accruing at the same time, and people are pushing for the pardon on the federal charges, largely due to the fact that the federal standard for how long you have to stay in prison before you're eligible for parole is actually significantly longer than the statewide standard. So even though Chauvin got 22 years on the state level, he could actually be eligible for parole after 15, but on the federal level, I believe he would have to serve something like 18 years because of the fact that they have a different standard in the minimum that you have to serve before you're eligible for parole. So that's the reason why people still, even if Minnesota won't change their mind on this particular case, want him pardoned at the federal level. But the reason behind even that is because people are highly disputing whether or not Derek Chauvin was able to get a fair trial. And in my opinion, whether you believe in the guilt or innocence of Officer Derek Chauvin, I think it is absolutely obvious that he did not get a fair trial. I mean, there were reports from in the courtroom that the jury could hear the rioters outside, who, by the way, were behind the most destructive riots in American history post the death of George Floyd, demanding a guilty verdict. We had a juror that actually went to a Black Lives Matter rally in Washington, D.C. wearing an I Can't Breathe shirt that was allowed to make this determination. And of course, you had all these other pressures, like media figures trying to dox members of the jury in order to do jury intimidation, plus politicians calling for a guilty verdict, threatening to be out in the streets like Maxine Waters if they don't get it, and specifically a guilty verdict on murder. So to me, the fix was in at the trial level, but the federal case Derek Chauvin actually pled guilty to, so that's a bit of a different animal. And in fact, we actually talked about an update to his federal case a little while back on this channel in December, when he actually won a preliminary motion to re-examine some evidence, because Derek Chauvin is appealing that case currently right now on the idea that he had ineffective assistance of counsel. And the reason why he's alleging this is because apparently a doctor reached out to his attorney to pose an alternative theory for cause of death, and he actually suggested testing to that attorney. However, that attorney did not inform Derek Chauvin of this alternative theory, and in addition to that, never ran the testing. And since Derek Chauvin pled guilty in that case, the only thing he can appeal on, if you guys don't know, is constitutional violations that are procedural, which must include things like ineffective assistance of counsel. So that's still pending on the federal level, but what's behind the drive to get this man pardoned? And obviously, if you are unaware, this is a campaign by the Daily Wire that is currently being headed up by Ben Shapiro. And by the way, just me mentioning him means I'm going to get a bunch of ridiculous, absurd, and stupid Jew-related comments about how the Jews are trying to divide us. But in reality, I actually think Ben Shapiro's series on Derek Chauvin has a lot of interesting merits to it. And to me, one of the most crucial pieces of evidence that is highlighted is the fact that there is false testimony in the Chauvin case where doctors and pathologists made the claim that the fentanyl levels seen at autopsy were based on blood samples at autopsy, and since your fentanyl concentrations go up post-mortem, in reality, Floyd had less fentanyl in his system at the time that he was actually alive.
And what's shown here?
So this is basically the postmortem concentrations or samples that were hospital blood samples that were submitted by Mr. Floyd, and we found fentanyl at 11 nanograms per milliliter and norfentanyl at 5.6 nanograms per milliliter.
Next slide, please.
So this slide shows what the ratio of the parent drug to the metabolite is. So 11 nanograms per mil divided by 5.6, the norfentanyl gave Mr. Floyd a ratio of fentanyl to norfentanyl of 1.96.
And essentially, does this slide show just the way in which you would calculate the fentanyl to norfentanyl ratio?
Yes.
Next slide, please. What's shown on this slide?
So this slide shows the ratios of fentanyl levels between 9 and 13 nanograms per milliliter. So that range was chosen because Mr. Floyd's fentanyl concentration was 11 nanograms per milliliter. And when we do driving under the influence work, we actually assign an uncertainty of measurement to that result. So if a driver had an 11 nanogram per mil fentanyl present, we would report that as 11 nanograms per mil plus or minus 2 nanograms per milliliter. So I did this to see, well, what kind of ratios do we see between postmortem and DUI cases when the fentanyl level is between 9 and 13 nanograms per mil? What kind of ratio do we see? And we can see in the postmortem cases, the mean ratio of fentanyl and norfentanyl was 9.05 with a median of 5.88 versus the DUI population where the mean was 3.2, median 2.24.
It turns out this is completely false. The blood that was drawn from George Floyd for this testing was actually pre-mortem, which means there was significantly more fentanyl in his system than the prosecution was alluding to at the time of the trial, which means that the cause of death being due to the fact that he swallowed a bunch of pills that contain fentanyl makes that extraordinarily higher. And to be clear, this is indisputably false testimony. You can see right here at the top where it says toxicology, it says see attached report for full details. Testing performed on ante-mortem blood specimens, that means before death, so not post-mortem, at 9 p.m. And then it says the HHC was performed on post-mortem urine. Now you could see clearly on this display that was put forward before the jury where it says Mr. Floyd post-mortem that these are the same exact ratios as the pre-mortem or ante-mortem blood draw, 11 nanograms per milliliter versus 5.6 nanograms per milliliter of norfentanyl. And if you don't believe me, it says right at the top, post-mortem. Later on, he's comparing George Floyd with post-mortem next to his name to other post-mortem concentrations, even though clearly and obviously the toxicology report labels this as ante-mortem, aka prior to the death of George Floyd, this blood was drawn. And by the way, this is something that I actually brought up to you guys as a possibility very early on in the case. My first video based on the George Floyd case, because I did not make a video during the course of the hysteria, was a reaction to the transcript of the body cam, and I noted in those transcripts that the officers took note of the fact that Floyd was foaming at the mouth, he had white stuff on his face, and he was actually complaining about him not being able to breathe prior to him being put on the ground and well prior to the knee being placed on his neck / back / shoulder area. So in reality, based on that evidence, I thought it was quite likely that George Floyd actually was somebody who died of an overdose, and we also had, in addition to that, a fentanyl pill in the backseat of a squad car. This was revealed at trial, which had George Floyd's saliva at it. So he actually spit up a pill while he was being pulled through the SUV, which indicates that he was very likely swallowing pills. And by the way, he had a history of this because he had a near overdose 1 year prior when he swallowed a bunch of drugs after being stopped by the police. Take into account the fact that his alleged drug dealer was also a passenger in the vehicle at the time, and to me, you have a solid case for reasonable doubt. This is something that I said throughout the process, and it looked like Derek Chauvin, had he gotten a fair trial, would have had a much better chance of acquittal. But the fact that they actually had false testimony in the case about when the blood was drawn, and thus explaining that the concentration levels in the blood meant something completely different, to me is clear and obvious evidence that this man did not have a fair trial on the state level, and I hope that he is currently filing appeals in that particular case in order to fight back against that conviction. But again, we're talking about the federal conviction, where Derek Chauvin's avenues for appeals are quite limited due to the fact that he took a plea bargain on those civil rights charges. He can only make the case that he should be entitled to an appeal based on a constitutional violation, which gives him very narrow parameters in which to argue, as compared to on the state level, where if he has new evidence that is considered compelling enough, had the jury heard it at trial, it would have swayed them, is the standard there, then he can get an appeal on the statewide charges. Now, I hope that lengthy explanation clears up a lot of what's going on in this particular case, especially because if you watch mainstream media like this Al Sharpton segment, if you hear from Democratic politicians like Tim Walz, you'll never actually get that side of the argument. You'll never actually hear the case for an unfair trial. You'll never actually see the arguments that cause of death is in fact in doubt. People won't point you to the autopsy that shows no life-threatening injuries to George Floyd's neck, but also shows fatal levels of fentanyl in his system at the time. People won't tell you or show you the video of George Floyd saying he can't breathe before he's even put in the car, let alone after he was dragged through the car and put on the ground, because they are trying to spin a narrative. But I also think it's incredibly important for you guys out there in the audience to understand when you're being fed bad information from the right-wing side. So a lot of people will tell you that George Floyd had a heart condition, that George Floyd had COVID, therefore George Floyd ended up dying due to those things, and it's not Derek Chauvin's fault that his restraint could have contributed to those deaths. Now, of course, if George Floyd died from an overdose unrelated to the neck restraint, obviously Derek Chauvin is not guilty of homicide. But if George Floyd died from a combination of the restraint that Derek Chauvin ended up implementing against him, and that restraint is considered to be an unlawful form of restraint, then all of those other factors that contributed to making him more vulnerable don't actually go against the crime that Chauvin was being charged with. The reason why you have standard procedures for police officers is because you might encounter people that have certain medical conditions. Therefore, if you violate those procedures, that could lead to that person's death. Now, we are going to get into whether or not Chauvin actually violated those procedures in a little bit, but I think it's important for you guys to understand that stating that George Floyd was uniquely vulnerable to dying from some kind of restraint does not actually remove Chauvin's responsibility, that case on the restraint being a contributing factor has to do with whether or not that restraint was lawful. It's really important for you guys to understand this, so I'm going to give you guys a bit of an analogy so you can understand, even though it's not one-to-one, but believe me, I know that that's the point of me using an analogy. So let's say I pull a firearm on somebody. I am guilty of assault with a deadly weapon because I am obviously putting that person in danger, whether I pull the trigger or not. But let's say I pull a firearm on an elderly person or a fat person or somebody with a pre-existing heart condition. They end up having a heart attack. I don't pull the trigger at all and they die. Obviously, I'm still guilty of assault with a deadly weapon, but in addition to that, I'm also guilty of murder. And the reason that I would be charged with murder in that circumstances is because if I'm actually committing a crime, which we can all agree, me pointing a weapon at an elderly person would in fact be criminal, assault with a deadly weapon, and that interacts with an underlying pre-existing issue that they have that causes them to die, I am still responsible even if their overall condition was ultimately what was cause of death, because I set off those pre-existing conditions. My action caused an interaction with their pre-existing conditions that resulted in their death. Therefore, I'm still guilty of murder. In that case, it would be felony murder or some other form of homicide, depending on the jurisdiction. But make no mistake about it, you would be held responsible for that person's death. So just as in that case, citing the pre-existing heart condition would not nerf responsibility for me, citing George Floyd's pre-existing heart issue, citing George Floyd's other issues like COVID or the pituitary issue that is alleged by somebody whose alternate theory on cause of death actually exists, does not necessarily on its own get Chauvin off the hook. The only two things that get Chauvin off the hook are a condition that was excited by George Floyd's condition that would have resulted in his death, regardless of what Chauvin did, a drug overdose that would have resulted in death, regardless of what Chauvin did, or if Derek Chauvin's restraint were lawful and then Floyd died because of pre-existing conditions that responded to a perfectly lawful restraint. And this is where we get into the manual that was not allowed in the trial at the time that shows nearly the identical hold that Chauvin used on George Floyd, which comes from the Minneapolis Police Training Manual, which was falsely testified to be a move that did not appear in said manual. Now again, for my podcast listeners, you can actually see the hold that Chauvin used right here. The only difference between this and what we see on the video is what side Officer Chauvin is on, and the reason why he's not on the opposite side, as is represented in the manual, is due to the fact that the vehicle is obstructing his ability to get on that side. So this appears to be what he was trained to do in that moment. Therefore, he does have a legitimate case that he actually acted in regular, ordinary operating procedure and was not the person behind the death of George Floyd. And of course, the misstatements in testimony, the bad evidence that was presented, may be enough in the future to get him a new trial at the state level, which could have a different result 5+ years removed from the Black Lives Matter riots. Now, it's important for you guys to understand that a few of these alternate theories of cause of death were presented at trial, were obviously voted against by the jury when they came to deliberations. But again, if we think about how the misrepresentation of the blood samples could have come into play for the jury, if we think about the intimidation from the crowd and a bunch of other factors, maybe things would have been different. So maybe in a future statewide appeal, Derek Chauvin actually has a chance, but it's very important for you guys to understand that it's much more difficult to reverse a conviction than it is to bring in evidence at trial, so Derek Chauvin has a long road ahead of him. And by the way, if you guys don't understand the ridiculous bias surrounding this case, get a load of Marianne Williamson when she has pitched the idea of somebody being told that he can't get a change of venue because he won't get a fair trial anywhere, and her reaction to that versus when she figures out that Tim is actually talking about Derek Chauvin.
If a judge were to say a fair trial would not be possible, so we're going to do it here anyway, would you find that acceptable in terms of how our system is supposed to work?
No, but I've never heard a judge say that.
So
a judge, I've never heard a judge say, and by the way, I'm having a little difficulty here because I think now it's a little too loud and I don't know if I'm talking weird because I'm...
No,
you're fine. You're fine.
I've never heard a judge say, I admit you couldn't get a fair trial here, but we're going ahead with the trial anyway. And I don't agree with every judge, but that's just something
And what do you think would be like? Let's say that hypothetically happened, and there was someone who was being charged with a crime, and the judge said they petitioned for a change of venue, and the judge says there's nowhere you can go that will free you from the bias of this place, so we're doing it here anyway.
I don't think that would be right, and somebody would be petitioning somebody. I mean, even in those cases, there is such a thing as judicial prejudice. Somebody would be arguing that there was judicial prejudice, and the case would not stop there.
What if the case did stop there, and the man
if
just
the
went
case
to prison?
did stop there, I'd be the first to say this is wrong.
Okay, so you see, she's against that. She's like, I can't believe that would ever happen in the United States. Your hypothetical seems so ridiculous. Obviously, I would speak up against that. And then he drops the bomb that he's talking about Derek Chauvin's case, and Marianne Williamson completely flips. Her body language completely shifts, and you see who this woman actually is.
And the man
if the
just went
case
to prison.
did stop there, I'd be the first to say this is wrong.
So will you stand up in defense of Derek Chauvin?
Wow.
Derek Chauvin
I
petitioned
know
for a
who
change
Derek
of venue,
Chauvin. Are you
and the judge
suggesting-
said there's no venue you can go to where you'll be free of any bias, so we do it here anyway. So is the issue...
Wasn't there some legitimacy to that, given the fact that everybody saw the video? Everybody saw the video, so how could there be lack of prejudice anywhere?
Right.
So are you saying...
So the question is about the Constitution and what is fair in the court of law, and not what we want to have happened because of our feelings.
I don't think
if the issue is a judge says there will be no fair trial for you, my argument is then there's no trial at all. And the man should be released because that's a limitation of our democratic system.
That's what your argument would be?
Absolutely.
Okay, so you and I totally disagree on that one.
If a court cannot grant a fair trial under the Constitution, then the court cannot imprison a person.
Yeah, well, you and I don't agree on that one.
But I think it is very important for us to answer the overall question, which is, what should President Trump do? Should President Trump issue Derek Chauvin a pardon on his federal charges? And my opinion on this as of right now, which by the way has nothing to do with the left-wing reaction, is not right now, not at this moment. Now, this is for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, all President Trump issuing this pardon will actually do in the short term is transfer Derek Chauvin from the federal facility that he's in into a facility controlled by the state of Minnesota. It will not actually lead to his release, so it won't actually change anything. Second, Derek Chauvin is already going through the appellate process in the federal courts related to his federal conviction, so I think that President Trump should let that process play out, because that process involves the judge ordering new testing of biological material related to George Floyd, and that could actually help set up for new evidence to be introduced into a state trial, which would then make the pardon actually more advantageous to Derek Chauvin, because it would actually change something up. And the third reason that's absolutely crucial and important is that even though I don't give a damn at all about the left-wing reaction, I don't care about their threats of riots, I think they should be held accountable for the riots that they did before, and we should hold them accountable for ginning up this hysteria now. The fact is, this is not something that Trump needs to spend political capital on at this moment right now, because in reality, it's not going to change the circumstances for Derek Chauvin until much later on when we start talking about eligibility for parole. This is one of those things that maybe you consider while you're going out the door, especially since, again, he's only going to be removed from federal custody to statewide custody, so it just does not seem like it's worth it to do at this moment in time, especially since Chauvin is getting a couple of victories in the federal courts. And again, I think it's important for that process to play out, because that helps set him up for appeals and a potential new trial in the state of Minnesota after this is all done. So based on all of that, I would not actually issue a pardon or commutation at this moment in time, because again, you're just sending him from federal custody to statewide custody, and it's not worth the political capital that you will burn in order to do that, because there are more pressing agenda items for President Trump at this moment in time. And again, this could be done on its own depending on how his federal appeal works. Now again, if President Trump wants to revisit this at the end of his term, then that becomes a more interesting conversation. Then I would issue maybe a pardon or commutation at that moment in time, so that he could be eligible for parole on the statewide terms rather than the federal charges, which by the way were just tacked on in the name of being excessive against this individual, and it only makes up a difference of about 3 years, which is obviously a lot of time according to Derek Chauvin, because he's the one who has to serve it. But as of right now, at this moment in time, I would let his federal federal appellate case play out because he's going through the process, and we'll see what that ends up churning up. But of course, I want to know what you guys think about all this down in the comments below. If you like this video, show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social medias, support me via support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about the Derek Chauvin pardon update. Till next time.